What's up, everybody? How's it going? So in this video, I want to talk about what I found to be the most important skill that a software engineer can have. And I want to share with you a few concrete examples and anecdotes of how this skill can actually be extremely helpful in the real world, so that hopefully you can come out of this video taking away something really useful and learning something really helpful. Now, this skill is going to be super important for all sorts of software engineers who work at companies, big or small, software engineers who are applying to companies and going through the coding interviews, software engineers who run their own businesses or are freelancers, and it's also not going to be limited to pure software engineering roles. It's also going to be applicable or very helpful for data scientists or site reliability engineers, all kinds of tech-related or engineering-related fields. Now, before we actually dive into this, I do want to give two quick caveats. The first one is going to be that this is really just my opinion. It's an opinion that I've heard echoed by a lot of other people, including a lot of people with more experience than me, but it is really just an opinion. So please don't take it for anything more than that. The second caveat is that when I'm going to be talking about software engineers here, I'm really going to assume that the sort of fundamental software engineering skills are present. In other words, if you don't know how to code, then perhaps learning how to code is going to be a more important skill than what I'm going to be talking about in this video. Hopefully that goes without saying. All right, the moment that you've all been waiting for, the most important skill that a software engineer can have is, drum roll, smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Communication. The most important skill that a software engineer can have is communication or communication skills, and let's talk about why that is. Now, when I say communication skills, I am not talking about public speaking skills. That's very important. Communication skills and public speaking skills are two different things. And while I do think that there's some positive correlation there, in other words, if you are a great public speaker, you tend to also be a great communicator, the inverse of that, or the opposite of that, is not true. In other words, if you are not a good public speaker, or if you don't really like public speaking, that does not mean that you are a bad communicator or that you are bad at communication. It could very well just be that, for instance, you don't like speaking in front of a crowd, or maybe you're a little bit shy, but that does not mean that you are not a good communicator. Another thing that's important to note is that there are two sides to communication. There's a verbal communication or oral communication when you're speaking out loud, and then there's written communication when you're writing. Now, of course, this is when people tend to say, but Clement, software engineers are coders, they're programmers, they code all day, they sit on their chair, stare at a computer, and type away on a keyboard all day long. Why do they need to be good at communication? But that is just not true. Software engineers do not spend their entire days coding. Yes, coding is a primary aspect of the job. You're going to be doing a lot of coding if you're a software engineer, but it is not the only thing that you spend your days doing, and that's something that's really important to understand. In fact, I think I saw a LinkedIn survey recently, or a LinkedIn sort of article, where they surveyed, I think, a bunch of software engineers in the United States, and I think that the software engineers reported that, on average, they would spend anywhere between 30 to 40% of their days coding, and the rest of the days were spent doing other things. And I can definitely attest to that. I think that for me, some of my days, the average would probably be around 30%, because I think some of my days would be as low as only 10% of my days coding. Even some days I wouldn't do any coding. There were some times at Google where I would spend a full week without any coding. And then there would be some days where I would be much more sort of heads down and spending maybe 80% of my day coding. So then the natural question is, what in the world do software engineers spend the rest of their days doing? And of course, the answer is, as you've seen in all of the day in the life of videos on YouTube, software engineers spend the rest of their days eating food and drinking coffee. And the answer is that software engineers have a lot of other responsibilities and tasks and activities as part of their job. Here's a non-exhaustive list of things that software engineers do that are not coding. Number one, writing design docs. In other words, giving a sort of high-level overview of the contentious parts of a feature or of a system in the form of a document before you actually implement it. Number two, code reviews, when you're reviewing somebody else's code and giving them written feedback on it, or sometimes verbal feedback on it. Number three, random whiteboarding sessions, where you kind of go with a peer at a whiteboard to kind of hash something out about maybe an implementation detail. Number four, I think we're at four, pair programming sessions, where you're not the one at the keyboard writing the code, but you're the one sort of behind the scenes helping the other person or guiding them or whatever. Then, status meetings where you're kind of giving status updates on your project to the rest of your team. Product requirement meetings where maybe you're gathering requirements for a product from another stakeholder who might have a lot more information than you do. Design sprints, API design sprints, UX design sprints, where you're in a room with a bunch of other people kind of hashing out how an API is going to be designed or how a feature is going to be designed from a front-end point of view given a specific UX requirement. Then one-on-ones with your manager or with your direct reports. Peer reviews, when you're writing like feedback for peers on their performance. Then self-assessments, when you're writing your own sort of feedback for yourself, right? You're assessing your own self for your own performance. Of course, this might depend on the company, but a lot of companies have that. Then I think I forgot emails. Emails, right? Emails are a big form of communication or a big thing I gave a spoiler there, communication, in case you didn't realize that we were talking about communication at this point. But emails, right? They're a big thing that a lot of software engineers are going to be doing. You're going to be sending emails about status updates or asking questions or confirming things, right? So as you can see, there are so many other things that a software engineer does during the day that is not coding or that are not coding. So what are the common threads between all of these activities? Well, the first one is that they all involve some form of communication, written or verbal. For instance, when we're talking about emails, you're writing emails, written communication. When you're in a meeting, in a product requirement meeting, you're talking to people, you're asking ideally the right questions, asking with the correct level of detail, verbal communication. When you're giving a code review to someone and giving them feedback on their code or maybe asking them a question on their code, written communication. When you're in a performance review with your manager or with your direct report, verbal communication, right? Knowing how to ask about your own performance, how to ask the right questions, or knowing how to give feedback or performance feedback to someone, whether it's positive feedback or negative feedback, constructive criticism. The point is, communication is rampant across all of these activities. Then the second common thread is that all of these activities are super important. Not only do they constitute, at least as a whole, right, when you combine all of them, they constitute like 60 to 80% of a software engineer's day, so clearly they're important from a time point of view, but also these activities can be really the sort of like things that shape the rest of your work, right? And the things that sort of make or break your success. And here, this is where I want to sort of give concrete examples of how that can be possible. So one example that I really like to share has to do with code reviews. And it's when people, typically this happens when a more senior engineer is giving a code review to a more junior engineer, and they will leave a comment in the code review that is extremely vague. An example that comes to mind, especially for a front-end code review, in front-end code, would be something along the lines of, let's make this component stateful, right? That comment assumes so much knowledge of the reader, right? That comment assumes that the reader understands exactly what the comment is asking. It understands what making the component stateful implies. And so that comment can leave so many, it can end up making so many other unanswered questions pop up that someone then might be scared to ask or whatever. And it just, in my opinion, right, it's an example of poor written communication that can actually have really bad, snowball effects afterwards. Another example of a place where written communication can really hurt a project is in an email, where I've seen sometimes people who will send an email, right? There have been a ton of back and forths, a bunch of decisions have been made, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of an email thread, someone will say, will send a very quick email that says, all right, so do we all agree on what X said at the end of that meeting? And somebody else will answer and will say, yeah, we agree, we're all set. And it's kind of like, okay, we all agree, but do we all remember the exact thing that X said at the end of that meeting? And are we all agreeing to the actual same thing? And oftentimes, you'd be surprised how often this happens. People are human beings, right? People make errors. And so people will sort of innocently agree to something in an email just because it's sort of poorly communicated in a written form, and it'll end up completely messing up a project, right? Or it'll end up causing just a lot more friction later on, where it's like, oh wait, but we agreed to that. Oh wait, you weren't talking about this, you were talking about that. And it leads to a bunch of problems. Then another example, sort of similar to that with regards to verbal communication, is when you're like in a meeting, for instance, and you have a lot of people, maybe it's like a big meeting, a lot of people are sort of debating about things, blah, blah, and sometimes you can tell, especially as a sort of like, if you're listening rather than talking and you see other people in a sort of heated debate, and sometimes you can tell that like, they're talking about the different things. They're arguing about different things, or they're sort of like, or maybe they're agreeing on different things. Like, okay, so we agree that we can make the API like this. Yeah, we agree that we can make the UI like this. And say, wait a second, you're talking about two different things. Like, this change that you want to make to the API that you think the other person agrees to, they actually think that it's going to have these ramifications. So you're actually not agreeing on anything. This is going to cause a ton of friction later. You better communicate verbally really well and really clearly, otherwise you're not going to be happy. And then the last example that I want to give is going to be in performance reviews, especially self-assessments, where I found that a lot of people will struggle to sell themselves well, or rather they will not paint as good of a picture of themselves and of their accomplishments as they could purely because of poor, or just, not necessarily poor is a little bit harsh, but just not as good as they could have written communication. And that can really affect your sort of personal career success, right? It can affect your chance to get promoted, or your chance to get a good sort of like performance rating if you're at a company that does that. So all that to say that communication, written and verbal, is so important, and there's so many examples that pop up every day where you can really see how important it is. In an interview, in a coding interview, for instance, I always like to hammer this point on AlgoExpert. We have a full video on AlgoExpert about communication. It's so important to vocalize your thoughts, and in interviews, it's probably going to be verbal communication that's really important. It's important to vocalize your thoughts so that the interviewer actually understands what's going on in your mind. How are you solving this problem that they've given you? So really, if I'm sounding like a broken record at this point, then I've probably accomplished what I wanted to accomplish, which is to say that I want to tell you that communication is extremely important, both verbal and written. I'm going to leave you now with very wise words that one of my engineering managers at Google would tell me a lot. And I think these words are originally attributable to a VP at Google. But the words are this: engineering is easy, people are hard. And I think that that's really true, and it very much relates to the idea that I've been trying to convey throughout this video, that communication, verbal and written, which is really a people skill and something that involves people, is just hard and very important. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Fagmingers net rufniri zeder the servants zerinjnu pas buishwina zoid the fjallon the edon and is visa zero snake so